my daughter with me today. Want to say hi? No, you just want to grab the mic. Okay. Hey everyone. So welcome to Faith in Capital. Today we are speaking with Haesung and Elisa, who are both a part of an anti-imperialist study group specifically for ex-followers of Sun Myung Moon, who, with backing from the CIA, officially launched the Unification Church in South Korea in 1954. Perhaps you've heard about the recent assassination of Japan's Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, by a son of a former widow who was brought into the Moonie movement. In this hour, we learn a little bit about the theology and practices of Moon's Unification Church, as well as its roots in imperialism and class exploitation. I will have some links for you in the show notes to learn more about the Unification movement and to connect with, gotta learn about this stuff, with the awesome collective Haesung and Elisa are a part of. So with that said, I learned a lot from my conversation with these two, and I hope you do too. All right, everybody, really cool guests with me today, Elisa and Haesung. They are part of an anti-imperialist kind of ex or former participant in the Moonie or the Unification Church movement with us today. And we're going to be talking about the recent assassination of Shinzo Abe, but also the Unification movement, its history, all that stuff. Really fascinating conversation. I'm looking forward because I knew next to nothing about it before I did a little bit of research, and we're going to learn a lot from Elisa and Haesung today. But before we get started, something that I thought that was kind of interesting to think about is I was looking at all these articles, and they're all obviously written from a very liberal analysis. And I've also it made me think about, okay, this is a religious, cult, and there's a lot of new Netflix documentaries being produced by, liberal analysis as well. So whether you hop on Netflix to watch a documentary about a religious cult, or you read an NPR article on Tatsuya Yamagami's assassination of former Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, liberal analysis and ideology would have us believe that the assassination was committed by a rogue individual, or the Unification Church itself was simply a cult produced by bad individuals. But before we get rolling, I want to name that everything from the emergence of this very evil religious phenomena and the fact that a working poor person living in Japan was led to assassinate the prime minister are products of the class struggle in the highest stage of capitalism, which is imperialism. We'll say more about this throughout the conversation, but this really, I think it's really important to know, because if you don't see history through a historical materialist lens, it's likely that we're going to end up reducing the problem to reactionary religious groups or bad individuals, as opposed to understanding the struggle between classes and between imperialist and semi-colonized nations. And the last thing I wanted to say up front was that, the Moonies, of course, are not the only group or organization in the world like this. I personally grew up in the reactionary fundamentalist evangelical movement here in the States. And I personally continue to suffer greatly to this day because of it. To exit these groups and organizations isn't easy. And it often leads to great levels of alienation and loneliness. And so I think it's really fascinating that you all are a part of an ex-Moonie group that is consciously anti-imperialist. So let's go ahead and start off by, would you want to introduce us? What's the group that y'all are, the collective that y'all are a part of, and then also introduce us to what we're going to be discussing today.
Okay, so Haesung and I are part of an anti-imperialist / anti-fascist collective that is yet to be named. Very new in the process of making that, for former Unification Church or Moonie members. So basically, we're looking to create education to foster support and dialogue about the environments that we have grown up in, as well as to potentially reach out to current members, hoping in some way to maybe de-radicalize them or give them an option out. So Haesung, is there anything you want to say?
No, and definitely like a big part of it's like part study group, part support group, part activist collective. So we definitely our meetings are like we read books and discuss articles and that sort of thing, but it often comes back to our experiences and kind of The intention of our collective is to root out reactionary and dehumanizing messaging we inherited as people who grew up in a fascist cult, as well as people who just grew up under a world under imperialism. So we're here to learn from the struggles of those combating imperialism and create resources and opportunities to solidify anti-imperialist sentiment or solidarity among survivors of the UC.
Yeah, this is really interesting because I feel like I've really benefited from Marxist class analysis because it helps me frame all of the suffering, the experience I still experience with my, first 20 plus years of human relationship with conservative evangelicals and my family as well. That the family bond is a particularly difficult bond, and I think perhaps you all have had that challenge. And then anytime you talk with people who leave reactionary religious groups or even non-religious groups like a fascist group, right? When you leave those groups, it's hard to make sense of it if you've been in there literally all your life. And anyways, I think Marxist class analysis has helped me depersonalize everything, right? When a family member or an old friend says something, it's not really because they're a bad individual, right? I think I have more of a class analysis as to why certain people have been led in certain directions in their life, or entire groups of people, whether in the US, South Korea, Japan. And so have you all found Marxist class analysis, or perhaps more generally anti-imperialist analysis, to help you make sense of what happened?
Oh, 100%. Because without that, I don't think people could. I don't think I personally, and a lot of people, would be able to make the connections that are necessary when dealing with a group like this that has been aided and abetted by various governments throughout the world to do the horrific things that they have done. Without that analysis, it wouldn't be a full picture.
I've never thought about starting like an anti-imperialist ex-evangelical group, but I could see how what y'all are doing is incredibly interesting to me, but also really helpful. But today, I'm excited to learn so much about the Moonie movement, the Unification Church movement, also this particular phenomena of an assassination of a prime minister in Japan, and how that's all connected to us here today. So let's go ahead and dive in. Before we talk about the larger global politics, I want to learn a little bit about the theology and the worship, the beliefs and the practices of the Moonie unification movement.
Well, Sun Myung Moon's religious career seems to have developed after he returned from Japan, where he went to a technical school during World War II. And even though his religious history is a little fuzzy, because when he was at that technical school, none of his Christian schoolmates or professors remember anything about him being a Christian, as well as his roommates, who were both his best friends and communist organizers. Allegedly, his conversion story started as a child after his family became Christian. And well, they became Christian, but before they were just kind of practicing traditional Korean religion, like Taoist shamanism, Confucianism sort of stuff. But they were affected by the revivals that were coming through North Korea and in all of the peninsula. And so they ended up joining an independent church that was very much affected by this revivalism. And so it kind of had a lot of the aspects of the kind of asceticism and disciplines that were popular at that time, such as like early morning prayer and praying in the mountains, which are still kind of common features of Korean evangelicalism, as well as onsu keto, or laying on of hands, and fasting and that sort of thing. So there are a lot of churches at that time that had varying levels of syncretism, having elements of like Taoist shamanism. And Moon claims that at 15 years old, Jesus came to him in a vision and told him he had to continue his unfinished work. And so part of the UC's theology is grounded in the Bible and the idea that Adam and Eve were meant to establish God's family on earth. But Eve was tempted and deceived by Satan into having sex with him. And then she had sex with Adam, deeming them both fallen and unable to produce God's lineage on earth. So in God's plan, they were supposed to wait until they were at a certain stage in their own spiritual development before they could have a sanctified union. And they went against that. So because of that, 2,000 years later, Jesus came as the new Adam and was supposed to establish God's lineage once again through marriage, producing a family and engrafting all people into this family, and usher in the spiritual and political kingdom of God. So according to UC theology, due to the failures of John the Baptist and the people of Israel. Jesus was crucified before he could accomplish these things. And so the UC believes that Sun Myung Moon is the second coming of Christ.
Hey, Sung, I'm sorry, before you go on, I want to pull out a few things that you've already named. That's interesting theologically. First of all, Moon is like a third Adam, right? Or a second Christ, right? And you know you're in trouble when the origin story is that the woman had sex with Satan, and that's the fall of humanity, right? Because the woman had sex with Satan, and then she had sex with Adam, the first Adam, and that's where sin enters in the world. Is that correct?
Yeah. Original
Yep.
sin. Yep.
Yeah.
So inherently very sexist, very let me also point out that the words that they use are blood lineage, which to me is a eugenics dog whistle.
Mm-hmm. Aren't there's kind of like a pure blood and kind of like a half breed of people in the movement. You're a pure blood if you're born into the movement, but I think I saw the words Jacob, what is it?
Jacob's child.
A Jacob's child if your parents are adopted into it or something. Is that correct?
Yeah, so Elisa and I are blessed children. So we were born into the Unification Church. Our parents received the blessing ceremony, but there's also Jacob's children, those whose parents joined the church, and therefore they didn't have God's lineage.
Yeah, this is all interesting theological stuff that certainly will have political implications that we'll flesh out more. But I just wanted to pull that out.
So though this theology pulls a lot from the Bible, full-time UC members don't usually consider themselves strictly Christian, but as people of the completed Testament age, so like in contrast to the Old Testament and the New Testament age. So it's believed that Moon is the fulfillment of all major religions' messianic and apocalyptic visions. So nowadays in the mainline Moon sect, the Family Federation or the Heavenly Parents Holy Community, it's believed that his wife Hak Jahan is that fulfillment. But yeah, otherwise, for those who grew up in the UC, Sunday service was like a lot of other churches. You had worship music or music and a sermon, though our music was a little bit different. A lot of it was written by early members in Korea, as well as like John Denver and the Beatles.
Country roads.
Yeah. But there's also a huge portrait of Moon and Han but that being said, everyday spirituality of the Unification Church are just definitely not typical of Christianity. Members are expected to like have offering tables or altars where there's a picture of Moon and his wife, sometimes his whole family, and members are expected to regularly put offerings or a food or light candles on that altar. And if you get like a holiday bonus at work, put your check on there and to offer it to Moon and his wife. And this offering table is also used like regularly for different unification traditions and various rites, such as the 8-day ceremony where a baby is dedicated to Moon and God when they're 8 days old. So central, though, to the Unification Church is their blessing ceremony or the marriage ceremony. These are the famous mass weddings that people know about when they think about Moonies. So like my own parents were blessed at Madison Square Garden with 2,074 other couples in 1982. And this ceremony is supposed to unite a couple and change their lineage. And part of that blessing ceremony is the 3-day ceremony that follows it, which is a directed set of like sexual rituals for the couple alone, and also for first generation or those who join the UC rather than being born into it. They have to do the indemnity stick ceremony as well, which is using a paddle or kind of a bat-like stick, and you have to hit your spouse as hard as you can 3 times on the butt, basically. And it's kind of public with other couples, so if you don't go hard enough, a church leader will do it for you. So there's a lot to be said about the rituals and traditions that you see. There's like countless stuff, to be honest, and there's a whole book called like The Tradition. I think there's even 2 volumes of it. But what we're dealing with today is all basically around the spiritual sales of the Unification Church, or the high prices that you have to pay for them. So we can go into that later, but I just also want to say that it kind of feels inaccurate to call the Unification Church a church or a religion, as it's just as much of like a business empire consisting of multiple conglomerates, Tungil, Happy World, Salo, And it's also an international political network and a tool of counterinsurgency throughout the world, including in Nepal and in the Philippines. So some people prefer to call it the Moon Group because of this, and I'm trying to get into the habit of saying that, but I'm not there yet, so I'm going to say both throughout this thing.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Elisa, did you have anything that you wanted to add before we move on?
Yeah, just, a couple of other things about rituals and stuff. Some of the more interesting ones, I guess, just to get off the top of my head, are family pledge in the beginning of the morning at 5 o'clock in the morning. When you go to the altar, you have to basically recite it's like a pledge of allegiance, but basically to family, which is what they call Moon and his family. And so that's supposed to be done like every morning at 5 a.m. So you got to wake up at the crack of dawn, do that right at the altar. Another one that a lot of people have very reasonable issues with are the Onsu rituals, which are basically beating yourself or others to the beat of a drum in order to rid yourself of evil spirits. And, depending upon how into it you are or the other people around you are, I mean, it's physical abuse regardless. But people have been hurt and or killed through it before.
Yes, yeah. And I'll say that mostly occurs in the Unification Church's kind of pilgrimage center in Korea. And that's kind of a source that place is a source of a lot of the spiritual sales and fraud of the Unification Church, and we can get into that later.
Yeah, but Onsu also does happen at occasional church events that they will hold in large hotels around the country or the world. So it's very weird to have be at a Hilton hotel and just a whole room of people beating themselves and others.
And then the security there, they're
right. They're just
they're
whatever.
Just
we'll let them do it. Whatever. Weird, but whatever.
Wow. When I was in college, one of my many jobs was a security person at a hotel, and I never saw that happen. But who knows? Maybe that was going on. Honestly, as we said earlier, we could do episodes and episodes, a whole series on all of this because there's so much within that theological worldview and practice to discuss. One of the things I think that is really powerful is that Moon and his wife, depending on which wife at which time, they're seen as the heavenly parent. And that is all about authority and power. And so with all of the sexual violence and the gender normativity and the financial extraction, I think that imagining that, Moon, or being told and being raised to believe that, Moon is basically the ultimate parent here on earth, the closest thing to the heavenly parent, that brings so much authority and power to what he says. And also, he basically expands the Bible as well, right? There's kind of like a third edition or some kind of third testament or an expansion of the Bible. Is that correct?
It's more like a textbook that explains unification theology, but then it's part of the canon. There's several books that are part of the canon, though.
And is it my understanding that there's a lot of explanation on how men are to relate to women in that book and how to achieve world peace?
Throughout his books. I mean, even the way you should part your hair is explained in the Chun Young. So yeah.
To the most minute details of your life, they will dictate what you do.
Wow. Yeah, this is all really, really interesting, really fascinating. And it's not just interesting for, say, ideological consumption. We're not just trying to consume something that sounds so crazy to us, but this affects people's lives. You two have been affected. But again, even if you didn't grow up knowing about or within the Moonie movement, there are other movements within the world as well where these kinds of phenomena, they hurt and they harm people, especially the working class, the worst, or people in nationally oppressed nations across the world. So I just want us to remember that this isn't some, I don't know, I'm kind of sick of Netflix putting out some documentary about a rogue religious group because they're not talking about obviously they're not going to say what is really causing and producing these things that are devastating families, that are tearing people apart. I mean, I don't know if a listener knows what it's like to try and journey out of a right-wing community. I mean, that's really hard. It's really alienating and it's not easy. Or, of course, the violence that group continues to support and participate in. This is a life or death issue that we're talking about. So I just want to ground our conversation in the reality, the materiality of what we're talking about.
100%.
Yeah.
On that level, I also want to point out that most of the rules that go for individuals who are part of the UC movement are not held to standard for any of the leadership whatsoever. They can do what they want.
So I hear you saying just like leadership in general is completely unaccountable.
Yes, completely unaccountable. They will live literally in mansions while the rest of us have to slough by on poverty wages, and also, despite with the poverty wages, give large amounts of money and support and time to the church.
Yes, and also and it's racialized that we're
100%.
mostly talking about Korean leadership, and especially with the Korean leadership, they'll often have a Filipino member or sometimes a Japanese member live with them and unpaid labor. Like sometimes they take away their passports and kind of trap them there to take care of their family, take care of their house, etc.
Yeah, I would say same for American leadership though too.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about this. How is this organization financially, this group or this movement financially exploitative? And where do economics kind of play into this, both internally and perhaps externally as well?
So there's a lot to it, but just because they have so many industries under their belt. But in the 80s, I could say that at least 3/4 of the income was from the Japanese church. So that would be a lot from these spiritual sales that we're talking about. And one of those spiritual sales, like the Unification Church in Japan, even started a whole new Buddhist sect in the 80s called Tenchi Seikyo. And it was in order to scam elderly Japanese people. And so they would go through obituaries in the newspaper and visit widows from those people and tell their spouse tell them that their spouse in the spirit world needed them to buy these marble bases or pagodas, and some of them would be recruited into the Tenchi Seikyo or some directly into the church, and some didn't join but kept paying out of fear of the spirit world. And so the church has a lot of different scams like this, and they fund global church operations, including the Washington Times. So yeah, due to Japan's occupation and war crimes and their role as the Eve nation, who yields to Korea, the Atom nation, they have to pay indemnity or a kind of spiritual debt by making extreme sacrifices. So members in Japan have been pushed to give up everything they have, including their inheritances, properties, all their assets. And the result is 3/4 of second gen in Japan can't afford to go to college in a country where a majority of people attend college. And also the demands on the members are just so extreme. There are some members whose job and mission they're assigned is to constantly call, visit church members to warn them about how if they don't pay, their family, their ancestors, their descendants are all going to experience profound destruction and misery. So one example of these extreme demands that are put on members, but especially Japanese members, are that all members worldwide were expected to purchase and study a book called the Chanseongyang, which I mentioned before, which is kind of part of the scripture. So for a UC member in the US, I think it was something like $210 or something like that. But a Japanese member cost tens of thousands of dollars. And so recently, the Unification Church in Japan did a press conference regarding the assassination, and they claim that we're just like any other church. We just want a 10% tithe. But even when it comes to the normal tithe, Reverend Moon expected 30% from all members. So the Japanese members definitely experienced some of the most extreme financial exploitation. But the reality is that all UC members, their lives were oriented around funding the UC, namely funding Moon's family. So whenever headquarters sent out a demand, we had to pay. If Hak Jahan was on a speaking tour, we had to pay. If Sun Myung Moon needed us all to go to a workshop to secure our family spot in the highest realms of spirit world, we would pay and we would go. And our fundraising went to the properties for them to buy. Sometimes those estates weren't even being used. So and Japanese members would constantly be bringing these suitcases filled with cash to Reverend Moon and Reverend Moon's family. And we know for a fact that a lot of the times with Reverend Moon's son and other kids, that money would go straight to cocaine and buying absurd amount of cocaine. Yep. So yeah, there's a lot there. But as I said before, when we were talking about that place Cheongpyeong in Korea, where it's kind of that pilgrimage center, that's where a lot of today's kind of scams are occurring, and there's kind of an indulgent system there at the moment. So members are expected to liberate 420 generations of their ancestors from hell or from low spirit world, and so they have to pay money to do that, and it costs lots and lots of money, especially, and it costs an absurd amount of money for Japanese members, who are the ones who tend to go there the most. And you don't just pay for your ancestors to get out of hell, you pay for wish papers. Like, you can make a wish, different levels of like, you can get a gold wish paper, a bronze wish paper, but yeah, and there's other things there that you can pay money for.
Yeah, this is helpful. I mean, so the Marxist class analysis of why people end up in these kinds of groups and organizations is because of their class exploitation, right? This isn't like a life-affirming group or movement, but there is economic exploitation. People are trying to make sense. Why is their life the way it is? Why are they so miserable? Well, it's not because Japanese imperialism was in South Korea, backed by Europe and the U.S., but then there was a Cold War struggle within Korea to oust the U.S. imperialists, right? There aren't capitalists and workers. There's a battle between good and evil, between God and the Satan who's having sex with Eve, right? Women. So I think on one hand, I think the class analysis really helps us understand how people can end up in these kinds of groups. But there's also, I hear you talk about this like economic extraction happening. And so the movement starts in I think 1954 in South Korea. And it's not just funded by, CIA or kind of U.S. Philanthropists, but it's paid for by the backs of the masses of working people who are brought into this. And if they leave, it's not like they can just walk away, right? They lose their family, they lose their communities, and of course there's also ideological capture that people are wrestling with. Is like, what does it mean to? How could you imagine leaving this group that demands so much of me, not just like intellectually, but also financially? I'm literally working to pay for my ancestors' salvation. There's just so much great at stake. I could see how that financial exploitative piece helps people stay in longer than it does pushes people away.
100%. On that note, I'd also like to point out the fundraising teams that the church organizes. Basically, these people will live in a van for extended periods of time, travel about the country or whatever country they're in, and basically be labor trafficked. I mean, not basically, just 100% labor trafficked for the purposes of, selling small tchotchkes or whatever in order to support the Moon family. And this is just another one of their sources of revenue, but one that is also extremely damaging because most of these people don't get enough food, sleep. They don't have any sort of like health care. They don't have they're completely untaken care of. They're at their wits' end and running on fumes and basically just those heightened spiritual feelings at that point.
Yeah, and I just want to say too that a lot of those people who are fundraising and stuff, they're being actively trafficked, and some of them,
yes,
I'm just going to bring in a quick example. Right now in the Philippines, there's the war on drugs, and Duterte, thousands have been murdered because of this war on drugs, and hundreds, thousands have been put into prison because of this. So, but for those who are, for those who are deemed recreational drug users, just smoke weed every so often, when they get arrested, there's an opportunity for you to actually go to this Moonie program. And so you can basically go for a whole year to a year-long Moonie workshop where you learn the divine principle, where you learn some martial arts, and then afterwards you're promised opportunities and to be sent all over the world, and business opportunities, working for a church business, this and that. But a lot of them just end up fundraising or working or living at a church leader's house and taking care of their family.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, especially helps us connect to how this whole thing is connected to imperialism. So let's talk about that for a second. Where did the unification movement begin? And what is the context of imperialism and colonialism when the Unification Church begins?
So as mentioned before, the Unification Church was formally founded in 1954. Though by the late 50s, several members who were involved in the Korean military and in Korean intelligence joined the church as well, such as Bo Hee-pak, who's considered the ideological architect of the unification movement. I'll say this too, though Sun Myung Moon may have been like, is the word like dictatorial, very controlling of our lives and among UC membership, at the end of the day, he was just a tool of imperialism and a useful narcissist to intelligence agencies and various right-wing organizations allied around global imperialism. And so he was also a product of the ruling class's interests. So I just put that out there just to clarify, because it is easy to just say like, this guy's fucked up and all these fucked up things happen because of him. But that's not, there's more to the story. And I think that often gets left out. But according to the CIA, by 1962, the head of the KCIA, Kim Jong-pil, reorganized the Unification Church to become a political tool of Korea. So since the 60s, the Moon Group has been manufacturing weapons for militaries and began engaging in anti-communist organizing and education in the US, Japan, in Korea. And all of the original Unification Church missionaries to the U.S. were linked, if not employed, by the KCIA, including Bo Hee-pak, as well as Jun Ri, who is considered the father of Taekwondo in the U.S. So much of their work was in advocating for stronger diplomatic relations with the Republic of Korea or South Korea. And there's a lot to be said about the UC's role in counterinsurgency and counter-revolution consistently. But one example in the 80s was them playing a role in funding and coordinating the cocaine coup in Bolivia, with church member Tom Ward working as a liaison between the ex-Nazi Klaus Barbie, who was engaged in the arms trade and drug trade and connected and mobilized neo-Nazi paramilitaries, and the CIA. So the UC also, through their organization, KALSA, which was an anti-communist organization, secured funding and support for Contras during the Iran-Contra scandal, and KALSA also made and circulated anti-communist, anti-Sandinista propaganda throughout Central and South America and the USA.
So after the official channels, after the official funding for the Contras was cut by, I think, was it Congress at that point or the Senate or something, there's reason to believe that they may have used the Unification Church and members in order to traffic things as a back channel.
Yeah, and during the 80s, like just more examples, the 80s, the FBI like privately contracted Moonies all over the U.S. to infiltrate and sabotage the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. It was a solidarity organization. So Moonies would join a local chapter, and just in order to get the membership lists to give to the FBI. Or they would just start fights on campuses when these activists were doing presentations or doing demonstrations. And several chapters had to move off campus because the violence that would happen during their demonstrations. So, and a more recent example, which a lot more research needs to be done on, is the UC's role in supporting counter-revolution in Nepal. They take a lot of credit for it, actually. But for over a decade, they have poured millions of dollars into Nepal, starting businesses, churches, a political party, getting members into the assembly, including a church leader who would become the minister for the Ministry of Peace and Reconstruction of the government of Nepal. They have worked with Maoist militants, seeking to create dialogue and harmony between the Maoists and other parties and institutions. And they even had members and officials of the Maoist party attend 100-day workshops about the divine principle or the Unification Church's theology. And so we also know that the church still has dozens, if not more than dozens actually, of contracts with the U.S. military, providing weapons, ships, and other equipment, and other militaries all over the world. And when it comes to colonialism and colonial dynamics, something that just comes to my mind is that, like, when I was a kid, I went to a service project in Paraguay, a mission trip in a way. It was like an interreligious, international service project, bringing people of different religions together, and that's how it was framed to us. And it was people of different religions. But that being said, we did these service projects along in the Chaco region of Paraguay, and we built schools. And I would later come to find out that Puerto Lleida, which is kind of, the church has built this, like, developed all this land, acres and acres and acres of land there in the kind of the middle of the jungle, that area that where Puerto Leda is considered kind of a holy land or a spot for pilgrimage by the local indigenous Chamacoco people. And so they used to go, or they do go on pilgrimages on this land. And so when the UC bought this land from some company who was just holding this land, they like their way of kind of appeasing the people was saying like, we'll build these schools, don't worry. So yeah.
Wow.
I just wanted to point out going back a little bit, the church's ties to the World Anti-Communist League and Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, which are basically large international fascist organizations comprised of members of the Yakuza, fucking Nazis, the Ustasi, just the world's worst fascists altogether, strong ties to those groups.
Mm-hmm.
And very strong, a lot of, co-membership between leaders.
Yeah, I think that's really important to understand, is that this group emerges in South Korea, where the U.S. is kind of infiltrating and trying to wage war against the USSR. This is a product of war between an imperialist nation, and actually in 1954 is when is after Stalin has passed and Khrushchev has taken power. So actually, the USSR is turning back towards capitalism at that time. But there's still the Cold War happening between these two, an imperialist and a newly social imperialist power. And as you all were talking about with fascism as well, I mean, the U.S. props up fascist dictators all over the world now. And we need fascism to reproduce U.S. global hegemony. And that's whether, that's both in Japan, South Korea, in the Philippines, as you were saying. And I think it's just really interesting that this group has basically been exported as a means for undermining any kind of communist or even like generally left political tendency that is pursuing ousting an imperial or colonial power or addressing material conditions.
Yes. A little bit more on that, specifically on the Soviet Union front. I think it was, 91, there was the World Media Conference in Moscow. And at that time, Moon was able to meet privately with Gorbachev. He was a very strong proponent of perestroika and glasnost, very publicly supported that. And also at that time, they were starting considerable student outreach on campuses throughout the Soviet Union and they would offer like a trip to the United States. They would offer these training sessions and do their workshops there and just take advantage of all of these youths. As they are wont to do, because, a lot of their outreach happens on college campuses. But this was just, taken in there during, that period of the Soviet Union. I think there's something to look at there.
Absolutely.
Or not the Soviet Union. The end of the Soviet Union. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. All right. So this is where the context that this group emerges from. Fast forward to last week, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was assassinated. So can you bring us up to date and tell us how are we brought to this present moment with this assassination?
Well, I know you're saying bringing us up to date, but we can't talk about Shinzo Abe without talking about the early Unification Church in Japan and its links to Abe's grandfather, the former Prime Minister Kishi, who played a major role in promoting and legally protecting the fledgling Unification Church in Japan. So the UC in Japan, when it first got there in '59, it struggled to find converts for a few years, but by '62 was able to convert 50 leaders of an ultra-nationalist Nichiren Buddhist sect, which had strong Yakuza connections. And so this gave credibility and foot soldiers to the movement. And Kishi himself was a rehabilitated war criminal. He was a fascist.
Rehabilitated.
Yeah.
Quote unquote.
Prior to being imprisoned, he was actually part of the Japanese occupied Manchuria government. He was head of the industrial ministry or something, and where he laundered money and formed links with the opium trade. So Kishi was released from prison on December 24th, 1948, after the U.S. government decided that he was the right man to lead Japan in a pro-U.S. direction. And this was also the same day as Yoshio Kodama and Sasakawa were released, who were both who both later became fellow travelers of Moon as well. Kodama was an ultra-nationalist criminal who built up a network of collaborators in China during World War II, namely with crime syndicates, and he was released by a U.S. military agency on the condition that he would support all anti-communist activities of the G2 CIC division in Asia. And these three men worked with Moon and the Unification Church in building, developing, and funding the World Anti-Communist League that Lisa mentioned. And Kishi himself would start the Liberal Democratic Party and the LDP in 1955 with the funding and guidance of the CIA. And initially, in the mid-60s, Moon established the International Federation for Extermination of Communism in Korea, which became Federation for Victory Over Communism in Japan, which Sasakawa, he was the chairman. So the U.S. built its headquarters, or the UC ended up building its headquarters on Kishi's land, and Kishi was known to have very early on developed a fondness for church members. He liked hearing them sing their holy songs. He loved seeing them clean up the neighborhood, and he would speak at church events through the 70s. And so since the early 70s, though, hundreds, if not thousands, of UC members have campaigned on behalf of the LDP's politicians. Many LDP members who received the UC support were required to attend Divine Principle workshops, though many didn't join. They just kind of did it so they would get the church's support. So yeah, Kishi's son-in-law, Abe, or Shintaro Abe, used church members as well in his campaign and depended on tens of thousands of their votes. And Shinzo had a very similar relationship, promoting and supporting Moonies in the LDP, with over a dozen members in his third cabinet. And in Japan, if you go to a church center during election season, you'll see LDP posters all over. You'll also members are constantly receiving texts and calls reminding them to vote for certain politicians. And today, more recently, Shinzo has been speaking at church events and church affiliated events. So with the Universal Peace Federation, sharing a stage with Donald Trump and Paula White and all these other terrible people.
Are you saying that they're not politically neutral?
No, a little, yeah.
Yeah. Just to make sure, I hear you correctly. The CIA helps fund and back the Liberal Democratic Party, which when I heard that, it reminded me of the Christian socialist parties and all throughout Central and South America that the CIA is known to have supported and funded as well. But finds this guy named Kishi, says, "Oh, you know what? You will be a great little puppet for us." And it's not. I also want to say it's not solely the U.S. calling all the shots, right? There's internal contradictions within a country called Japan, where their rulers are trying to gain class power and the ruling class position over the working masses in Japan. But then there's also that contradiction between imperialist and semi-colonial, or Japan having lost in the World War II. They've been brought under the new imperial power, which was the United States, especially after Japan got their ass whooped by a bunch of communists from their West. And so I think this understanding of history helps us understand kind of what's happening here between a movement that starts in South Korea and ends up in Japan and is now CIA-backed religious movement for basically electing a lot of really right-wing fascist politicians. Okay, so then we have Tetsuya Yamagami recently assassinate Prime Minister. So how do we get there?
So this is where things get interesting. Not that weren't interesting before. Oh gosh. Okay, where do I even start with this? His reasoning for assassinating Abe was Abe's involvement with the main line of the Unification Church, which his mother belonged to. She gave several large donations to the church, basically bankrupt the family, gave up his college tuition. He had to drop out. Again, as Haesung was saying, in a country that most people are able to pay for college in. And then there's the part of the story that he was currently involved in an opposing sect of the Unification Church. There are a couple of sects, but there is one that comes to mind. Sanctuary Church or Rod of Iron Ministries is, I think, probably the most likely sect that he was involved in. And they have been in the news within the last couple of years for having the AR-15 gun blessing ceremony, because in their theology, the Rod of Iron is the gun. That's what that is to them. So they basically worship guns. They were at the January 6th insurrection here. On the Japanese end of things, the Sanctuary Church has also been organizing QAnon-related protests in Japan. And very recently, Sun Moon, the head of that branch, one of Moon's sons, was in Japan. And at one of the events, he was berating the audience for supporting his mother. And when they decided to speak up against him, he had them forcibly thrown out of the room. So it's obvious that he is having his own internal church coup. Another interesting point there that is definitely worth saying is that he and several of his other brothers want their mother, Hak Jahan, dead. Not specifically dead, but beheaded. And another thing that points to Yamagami being a part of Sanctuary Church was that apparently in 2019, he was trying to enter to one of Hak Jahan's events to hurt her or kill her, and was not able to get into the event. And so this recent sort of inflammation there is probably related to that, in my opinion. Verdict's out, I guess, but I could see those easily being very related, especially considering the gun aspect,
And I'll say this, like, I personally am not convinced either way yet, that he was a part of Sanctuary or not. But the week before the shooting occurred, Hyungjin, or Sun Moon of Rod of Iron Ministries, was in Nara, where the shooting happened, saying to the church members, Hak Jahan is scamming you. The Unification Church is scamming you. They're ruining your family's lives. So there is reason to see that could, reasonably that could agitate somebody. But that being said, it's still unclear.
That part is,
and it would have been at least 2 decades since he would have been involved in the church. So I don't know if he would have maintained faith in Moon for that long. And
Right.
So we may know, we may never know the conscious, explicit motive or reason why Yamagami killed Abe, and yet we do know that his mother and his entire family, his entire community, his life was devastated by the conditions of capitalism within Japan, but then particularly a hyper-exploitation of this religious group that brought their family to contribute all of this money from their surplus labor, right? These are wage workers. They're not petit bourgeois. They're not, or at least they're not bourgeois, right? They're not going to be really wealthy members of the movement, but they were brought to bankruptcy. And that kind of alienation, but also just that kind of frustration with the material and psychological and relational suffering, that deterioration, I think it makes total sense why you would go after someone like Shinzo Abe, who is one among hundreds, if not thousands, of politicians or celebrities that show up to these Moonie events and give a little speech, take a little paycheck, and they support this movement, right? These politicians don't have to be in the Moonie movement, but it kind of gives them a sense of legitimacy. Or if you see the name like Donald Trump or Paula White or, again, Shinzo Abe on this list of people who showed up to this really big conference and event at the Hilton in, I don't know, Seoul, then you can use that to tell the adherents, to tell the Moon community that this is working, that this is really powerful, and that you're a part of something. Therefore, all right, let's give another $1. Let's give another $100. Can you give another $1,000? What will you sacrifice for the work of God, right? There's a lot of, I think, capture in using these really powerful politicians to reproduce the legitimacy of the movement. But it also complicates things because, the working class in general, we don't have a state, right? This is basic Marxist-Leninist Maoist analysis. We don't have a state that serves us. But even if you had the liberal analysis that you could just go to the cops or go to the politicians and be like, oh my, look at these evil shit. Well, they're actually wrapped up in this as well. So there's no way out.
Yeah, and the reality is like it's not just like right wing blatantly right-wing people are doing. Like Obama's taken
Right.
money and spoken at a church event, you know. And so I mean, so Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton have received the holy wine, you know. So it definitely, and I just want to say a few, like just a couple things about his like motivations, or Yamagami's motivations, if
Mhm.
that's cool. Something that should be noted is that like Japanese culture isn't like one of second chances. So when he dropped out of one of the top colleges in Japan, this was like a huge source of shame for him, for his family, and it was a huge derailment for him and blocked him from the opportunities he worked really, really hard for. And I also want to say that like when second generation in Japan, but also in the U.S., heard about this incident, we all understood. Like
Mhm.
it was the kind of suffering that the church produces. It does cause violence. I mean, this is not the first time that violence came from the suffering of Japanese members. There's so many suicides among the Japanese membership, and not only that, there's been other like incidents similar. Like, I mean, I know my pastor's wife growing up, she set herself and a church leader on fire in protest of the high donations that are asked of Japanese church members. Yeah. So, but I also want to say too is that like, yes, Abe just kind of received checks from the church, and so did his dad, and so did his, you know, whatever. But at the same time, their family, it is like a partnership that existed for 3 generations, and like without Abe or without Kishi's literal legal support and connections to the Yakuza, the church probably would have been stamped out early on.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, as Haesung was saying, I guess it's all of us who have been a part of the movement and come out of it are in probably constant pain because of it. And regardless of whether Yamagami was currently a part of the movement or not, he is, in that sense, a victim of the crimes that this society and these structures of imperialism have perpetrated on so many people. You know, he chose to take that into his own hands and commit violence himself. Not saying that's great by any means, but it's not also unheard of or unprecedented when it comes to that sort of abuse.
Yeah, personally, I mean, I take no sadness in Abe being murdered. I know,
Same.
I think they're really, really evil people who they side with the ruling class at the expense of the working masses. And we're not just talking about, exploitation. In theory, we're talking about poverty, hungry fucking stomachs. We're talking about sexual exploitation. We're talking about colonialism. And so I have no problem with these people being murdered. Yes, from a communist analysis, though, we have to understand that assassinating 1, 2, 10, 30 people is not going to address the class relations. And so that's where Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, I think, helpfully brings us into, okay, if assassinating person, like Bonhoeffer, right? He was like, oh, I'm a nonviolent person, but God, we got to assassinate this fucker. So Bonhoeffer, everyone knows he was a part of an attempt to assassinate Hitler. That's great. I'd love to see Hitler dead before he killed himself. I would have loved to see the masses get to Hitler before he killed himself. But we have to understand that that's not going to address class relations. It's not going to address the contradictions of imperialism, of colonialism, or capitalism. That's where we have to come about it from a different angle. And I think Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, developing a proletarian struggle, a protracted people's war, that brings about an actual real shot at the masses ending their exploitation and oppression in establishing class and political power. So let's go ahead and talk about that for a second, because again, if you read an NPR article about this, you may be led to believe that we need to just solely teach people that being a reactionary is bad, or we need to, stand with America and fighting like crazy fascists in somewhere else in the world, right? But I think as communists, we can come from a different perspective here. So what do you all think needs to be done about the creation of reactionary groups like the Moonies? Who, again, it's not the only group. I grew up in evangelicalism, white evangelicalism here in the States. So to me, the unis aren't actually all that unique, but they're a particular manifestation of something that happens generally in nations all over the world. So what is to be done? How do we move forward, perhaps on short-term strategies and things that could be done? And then also, what are some long-term things that need to happen?
So yeah, that's what our reading group slash study slash anti-fascist group has sort of been grappling with lately. We're all very much feeling, the fallout from this, as well as the rest of our lives involved with these systems and people. I think a lot of it has to do with education, just because without the proper reference points and understanding of a situation, there's not really any way you can address it. Also, other things, we would like to set up sort of like education for de-radicalization, specifically for people who are currently involved in the church, possibly a fund for ex-members who are dealing with sort of the daily financial stress of having come out of a movement like that. And because I know like most of us don't have good mental health, just like it's almost impossible to have after living through what we have. Let's see, what else? Hazel?
Yeah, so I think something that comes to mind for me is just thinking about how so many people who left the UC don't think about it after they leave or do their best not to. And it's very difficult to reflect on, not just because of financial exploitation, but all sorts of trauma related to the UC, including ritualized physical abuse from leadership, forced marriages, etc. So that said, this is not something you can like push down forever. And something for me is having this group, like somebody came to one of our meetings for the first time and they're like, I don't think about the church because I can't think about it alone. Like it's just too much for me to think about alone. I need to think about it with other people. So kind of this collective, like I don't want to overspeak what it is. It kind of started out as just like a reading group, and in many ways right now is just a reading group. But like that's where we are right now. But it's really helpful in the sense of like thinking through these like big ideas and relating it to our experience and kind of extracting real things and analysis from those experiences and kind of uproot, like getting rid of these terrible ideas that we not just got from the church, but we just got from being growing up in the United States or, growing up under imperialism. So like that's been great for like deconstructing harmful ideas and that sort of thing. But it's also been, I don't know, I think it's important too, because there's so much, like you were saying, like religious institutions all over the world. There's like, that's one of the ways for the bourgeoisie to have control over people, to affect and influence how people think. I mean, even like Christian missionaries all over the world today are cooperating or working with the CIA, even though there was like a law in the 70s that was passed that said you can't do that anymore. The CIA can't do that anymore. That's ignored, Yeah, but
they don't give a fuck.
That's a thing like everywhere. So I don't know. I do think that like for those of us who grew up in the UC, like it's important, I think, to understand the UC, the nature of it, its dynamics, in order to understand the things that programmed us and how our thinking was formed. But also, like, pressing into this history reveals a lot about the nature of imperialism and capitalism. And I feel like there's almost this, like, there's so many lessons there we just get from just talking together about our experiences and relating it back to a Marxist analysis. So when it comes to, like, long-term, like, what is to be done, like I'm saying, the church, the UC, the Moon Group, whatever, is a microcosm of imperialism in so many ways, with the exploitative businesses, marriage, labor, drug, weapon trafficking, racialized hierarchy, support of right-wing paramilitaries and coups and dictatorships, collaboration with Nazis and fascists, countless human rights violations, all that stuff. So these dynamics are the dynamics of imperialism produced by imperialist conditions. I used to think that the Moon family was exceptionally evil because they're raised to think that they're special and holy. All these people want to serve them. But then I think about every billionaire, and that's everyone's serving them. Everyone's, feeding them love. They're all safe and feel very entitled, and that affects their class consciousness, affects them and how they treat others. And so
very normal for them.
Yeah, it's kind of normal billionaire stuff. And so that for me was kind of a revelation when coming into anti-capitalism and stuff. So Truthfully, the only way to end the sort of corruption and abuse of the Unification Church and other organizations like it is to abolish imperialism. And of course, that means world proletarian revolution. But yeah.
Oh, in the meantime, we're just also, I think a lot of us are very much enjoying sort of finding a community of people who understand what it's like, but are also out on the other side of it and willing to be part of a community still, but on these different terms, not on the terms that we were raised with, not forced community. It's community that wants to be there because we care about each other.
Yeah, I can't reiterate enough. I am super excited and encouraged by your collective that you all are doing, because I think in the short term, how do you fight a group like the Moonies? Well, you do exactly what you're doing. You start a small group of ex-Moonie people, and you invite other ex-Moonie people into this, but you do it from a particular, or at least a general political line, and understanding how imperialism is a root contradiction of what happened to you all individually and personally all across the world. So I really love and appreciate your work and your knowledge and your all's devotion to this fight. And I think your organization can help demystify what's really happening and what really happened to us personally, rather than just kind of getting lost in that individualism. And I know a lot of the ex-evangelical movement seems to be a very alienating movement to me. And people find others on Twitter, but that leads them to deconstruct theology, but not necessarily to formulate a new political ideology. And the second thing is, Hae Sung, as you were mentioning, I absolutely agree. Proletarian revolutions, protracted people's wars, which is a material and historical necessity. The contradictions of imperialism, of capitalism, and colonialism have to be brought to an end, else these things will continue to happen. And so we organize people around the particular and specific issues that they communicate to us that they can be organized around. Of course, from our Marxist ideology, right? We're not going to organize people around just anything, but we need to start organizing people. We've got to move away from that, and especially here in the U.S. And so I think organizing people for actual genuine new people's democracies and organizing people for socialism, that's going to take decades and decades of struggle here in the U.S., of course, but it's a task that it doesn't matter if it seems big or not to you. It's a historical necessity. And so where do we start? We start with these collectives that you're doing, but we also we got to start organizing people around the issues that they're concerned about and connecting it to how colonialism, settler colonialism here, or imperialism, the U.S. imperialist relations across the world, or capitalist exploitation here, how that's creating the issues that people face here.
Yeah, 100%.
All right, Elisa, Hae Sung, y'all are incredible. I really appreciate you taking out some time of your day and sharing with us. Best of luck with your work, and I'm definitely going to follow this along. And folks, if you know any presently Moonie or ex-Moonie persons, try and get them connected to this collective with Hae Sung and Elisa. I think this will do wonders for ex-Moonie people.
Hoping so. Thank you so much.
Thank you for giving us this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Yeah,
I just wanted to say, like, a lot of times among those who survived from the church or those who left the church, the element of imperialism gets left out of the analysis. So I just really appreciate getting the time to clarify things.
Yeah, very much so.